Welcome, welcome, welcome everybody to another Sunday of When Black Women Gather. My name is Helen Higginbotham and I host these calls every Sunday. And we've been doing it, believe it or not, today for 3 years. We've been doing this online since the pandemic. March 24th was our first gathering and we've been here almost every Sunday ever since. So for those of you who've been a part of it, give yourselves a pat on the back and thank you so much for continuously being supportive of this effort. So When Black Women Gather is a gathering space, that I've created for Black women to be able to come together and have conversations where we pass on wisdom and tradition. And of course, a part of our wisdom and tradition includes our men. So when we are able, of course, we have our Black men come in and join with us. Sometimes we even have white women come in and share on whatever the conversation may be. But today I'm excited that we have two guests who are going to talk to us about Pan Africanism 2023, looking back, looking forward. What is Pan Africanism? How did it begin? What has it evolved to over the years? It's going to be an exciting conversation and I'm so glad you're here. But before we get started, I wanted to say happy anniversary to all of us who've been here for 3 years. And I also wanted to keep you abreast of, inform you about two projects that are happening in the community that I want us to support as an organization. One is my good friend, Gary Brewer, who is a filmmaker. And he's doing a documentary that is a tribute to Black jockeys in the Kentucky Derby. And I love the title. It's called Bet on the Dark Horse. I think it's a part of history that we probably not as familiar with as we should be. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'll share with you all online some information on how we can support Gary and that effort. And also Dr. Peggy Bertram. I don't know if she's on the call, but Peggy has reached out to me. She is writing a book, and she wants us as Black women to share letters that she can publish for the mother of Tyree Nichols. And you all know he was the young man who was murdered at the cops in Memphis. Peggy's been on here before, and she did a book to Kamala Harris, if I'm not mistaken, when she first got into office. So it'll be the same concept. So thank you so much. And for those of you who know, in a few weeks, we'll be leaving to go to the Gullah Festival. So if you're still interested in that, reach out, let me know. So on that note, I'm going to bring my guests on screen with me. James Early, and where's Dean Keene? Can you help me, Laura? Do you see Dean Keene? Oh, I see him. There we go. All right. Hey, guys.
Afternoon.
Okay. Thank you both so much for coming. This is going to be a fantastic discussion. I have to disclose that all of us just happen to be Howard graduates. That's quite by accident, I promise you. No, it really is. And I have to also share with you that I was unsuccessful at getting a female co-host for this discussion, not for lack of trying. So please know that I do not overlook the contributions that women, Black female warriors, have made to the struggle and can contribute to this conversation. But there were just some unforeseen circumstances that happened, and I was not able to recover soon enough to get us somebody. So we'll be doing this conversation again. So don't worry about it. And also throughout the conversation, both Dean Keene and Mr. Early will interject the contributions of the women that they know who have been in this struggle. So women are a part of this discussion. Let's just be clear, okay? So somebody's saying they're getting an echo. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yeah, I'm not getting it. When I saw that note, I'm not getting it.
Okay.
I don't know anybody else.
So right now,
no echo on this end either.
Okay, great. Okay. I can't understand whoever that is. So anyway, so let me continue on. So our program today is called Pan Africanism 2023, looking back, looking forward. We have two distinguished guests who are I won't even say former because they're continuing in the struggle. So they are both active Pan Africanists. I wanted people who were around, in the 60s and the 70s, and who can just really tell us about, the origins of Pan Africanism and why we have Pan Africanism. What does it look like today? I said in my note, which I thought was pretty cool, if I say so myself, that I think we're all caught up on the cosmetics of Pan Africanism. The natural hair, the daishikis. We all take trips to the motherland, and we love, the illusion of Wakanda, but do we really believe it? Do we practice it? Do we really believe that we are one? And that's what we're going to talk about today. I want you to know that this will be an interactive conversation, more so than normal. I'm going to step out, and Mr. Early and Dean Keene will handle this totally. I'll be interjecting, helping make it. But the bottom line is that this is our conversation. They do not want to lecture to you. They want it to be interactive. They want it to be informative. And for you all to, have questions. There is no stupid question. All questions are welcome. And, my motto, we will be respectful to one another. Otherwise, we can't have a conversation. So that's the only rule we have here. Comfort level is not an issue because we're grown people. We need to move beyond our comfort and have these kinds of conversations. So that's not going to be my concern today, as it isn't on any other Sunday. But again, what is not negotiable is respect. So on that note, let me introduce our first guest, which is James Early. Mr. Early has been with us before, and I'm appreciative that he is a constant supporter of ours, even if he's not on screen, he's following what we're doing. So I thank you for that. Okay. All right, so Mr. Early is a self-described eclectic and a cultural educator. He's actually born in Florida. You all know I just recently moved to Florida. Yes, I did. Anyway, he is a Morehouse man, earning his BA at the esteemed HBCU before attending that other esteemed HBCU, Howard University, where he received his master's and studied for his PhD. During this time, he studied in Panama, at Canal Zone College, and at Georgetown University. Over the years, he has held a variety of positions and worked at many organizations. He worked at Smithsonian Institution as a folklore consultant and researcher. He was a former Assistant Secretary of Education and Public Service, Director of Cultural Heritage Policy, Interim Director at the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum, a former board member at TransAfrica Forum, and he was a producer and writer and host of a weekly radio show on WHUR, which is Howard University's HUR-FM, which is Howard University's radio station. He is well traveled, conversant in several languages: Spanish, Portuguese, and Mandarin. Fluent in Spanish. I'm not sure if you're fluent in the others too. I don't know. He'll tell us.
No, I work in Portuguese, and my Mandarin is a simple historical reference for which has no functionality at this point.
Okay. He enjoys a rich history that has provided him the opportunity to work with and get to know several world leaders such as Fidel Castro, Queen Mother Moore, and Kwame Nkrumah. I invite you to Google him and become more familiar with him and his work. He has been with us before, and we welcome him again today. So thank you, Mr. Early. And then we have William Damani Keene, who you will only hear. I try to call him Damani, but it's hard. He's just Dean Keene to me. He was the Dean of Residence Life when I was the GA at Howard, and I try. I'm going to try harder today to call him Damani. But so I know him from my years at Howard. And many of you probably know him and his lovely wife, Ife, as regular guests and contributors to When Black Women Gather. I am thankful for their support and that they always show up whenever I ask. So thank you, Dean Keene. Bill Damani Keene spent his early years in Harlem and Queens, New York, before attending Howard University, where he met his wife of 57 years. And I have to note, for those of you who weren't on the call earlier, Mr. Early has been married for 51 years. So these are two solid Black men. Okay, I'm just saying. So you can unmute and give them a what do y'all do? Snaps, claps, whatever. Because I'm impressed. I love it. Upon graduation, Damani served as an officer in the Air Force, during which time he taught Black history in a federal penitentiary. That had to be interesting. Not surprising, but interesting. Before returning to Howard University to enjoy a lucrative and fulfilling career, he worked briefly as a community organizer in, I was going to say Barack Obama, because community organizing is go to Barack Obama, in Brooklyn. And he studied for his master's at Cornell University. He retired from Howard University after working there for 32 years, holding several positions to include 14 years as dean of residence life. He was not a vice president. That's what our flyer said. He wants me to be sure and correct that. So it's on record. He was not, he should have been, but he wasn't. Okay. And he said, if he was, can you please send him the appropriate pension? Okay. Always the activist and committed to uplifting the community. He actively supported the African liberation movement and worked very closely with Kwame Ture, better known as Stokely Carmichael, for the better part of a decade. In retirement, he has served as an alumni trustee on Howard University's Board of Trustees, and he has conducted extensive research with his wife and penned a self-published book that I highly recommend that you read. And I hope that you guys will be placing it in the chat so people can purchase it. And it's called Clandestine: The Times and Secret Life of Mariah O.T. Reddick. And it is a historical novel inspired by the life of his enslaved great-grandmother, Mariah. So look for the link in the chats. He and his lovely wife currently live in Panama and have a beautiful home that they're looking to sell. So if you're interested in moving to Panama and need a beautiful home, inbox him or Ife. They're both on this call and they want to sell their house. So on that note, I'm going to bow out. I'm going to turn it over to, and Dean Keene is having technical difficulties, so just bear with him. I think we can hear him, and even though he's freezing sometimes. But I'm going to remove myself from the screen, mute myself, ask everybody on the call to please mute and give both of these men your undivided attention, and they will talk to you about what the format will look like. So thank you again.
Good afternoon. I am really pleased to join you. Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you loud and clear.
There's nothing more important than self-organization within our community and proactivity from wherever we sit in our community. And this women's gathering is a really important example of that goes very broad. And so I am pleased to be with you. I'm very mindful that as two sort of interlocutors, Bill Keene, who was my dean as well. So when I was a graduate student at Howard, he was very helpful and instrumental to my development. I'm pleased to be with him. I was looking for a quote from Mary McLeod Bethune to give you the exact quote, which indicates that the Black community's maturation and integrity is measured by the quality of Black womanhood. We don't generally think of her in the formal terms of the advocates of Pan Africanism. I'm going to read a direct quote later that will uplift us and contextualize why. As has been pointed out, this is not a lecture. One can go online and find oodles of materials and perspectives about Pan Africanism, founded somewhere around more formally in the mid 1800s. With African Americans, some people will use the term African, others will use the term African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, any number of principal, particularly men who emerge from that. We will not try to rehearse that full history, but it's important to note that as a result of enslavement and colonialization, enslaved Africans, not slaves, but enslaved Africans who always had thought and outlook and sentiment and feelings and memory, always were connected. We were never disconnected from the continent of Africa. And we were always in motion of trying to get back to Africa. We know of the Back to Africa movements here in the United States coming out of enslavement. We know about Marcus Garvey, another Pan Africanist. We know little about Africans in Brazil, where the largest number of African descended people in this hemisphere still live, about 54% of the population, over 100 million people who in the official census of Brazil identify themselves as Black and are mixed race, who are still worshiping, many millions of them, African deities in what we know to be the west coast now of Nigeria and Benin, whose eating ways and clothing ways and whose musical expressions are very consciously tied to that. Nor do we know very much about los que volvieron from Cuba, enslaved Africans who got out of slavery and made their way back to Africa, and the ongoing connection of Cuban national society, no matter whether you have blonde hair, blue eyes, green eyes, brown skin, or black skin. The cultural ethos of Cuba is very Africa even today in all kinds of ways. These are contextual expressions of Pan Africanism. And as I said, I don't want to go and rehearse a list of all of the extraordinarily known Black men coming out of Trinidad and coming out of the US, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who really was the sort of engineer for brokering the international organization of this, or the ties of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president to emerge in defeating colonialism in '57 in Africa. You can go online and find out things about that. What is less talked about and needs to be really talked about a lot are two key women interlocutors in the 20th century, both coming out of Louisiana, Queen Mother Moore and Dara Abukari, both coming out of Louisiana, who were very much involved in the Republic of New Africa, independence movements, revolutionary action movements. These are more my contemporaries, and I suspect also Bill's contemporaries, that I did not fully understand when I was coming up, but who loom very, very large, not just as women figures, but women leaders who set a context for a lot of the men of our generation who emerged with more notable concerns. Pan-Africanism, unifying Africa, that our freedom in the Americas and in the diaspora, remembering that there are large numbers of African descendants in Europe, not just in London and Paris, which are colored towns, if you will, reflecting the history of colonialism, not only enslaved Africans and Caribbean and African descendants and contemporary migrants coming out of Africa, but also of Indians and other colonized people of color. Recalling that in 1903, when W.E.B. Du Bois wrote The Souls of Black Folk, connecting us to that African background, he said he was also talking about all of the people of the Mediterranean Sea. He was looking at the issue of color, not just Black skin color, but non-white people in the context of colonialism. So there are narratives about colonialism, narrative stories that we need to reclaim, but then there are the formal mid-19th century emergence of the terminology. How does that bring us from sort of historical backdrop to where we are today? Any number of people from different ideological and political perspectives inhabit the terminology of Pan-Africanism. There are Africans who have come to the United States in the 20th century who are now citizens, not just immigrants, some of whom are embedded in a capitalist enterprise orientation, who argue that they are the real diaspora, not us. We see those reflections in the reparations discussions of some who say, well, unless you're a descendant of someone who can have been identified as enslaved in the United States, you should not be in the reparatory justice implementation here in the US. So there are a lot of ideological factors that come into play. You have people like the great C.L.R. James, who both Bill and I knew and had an opportunity to interact here, perhaps the leading Marxist theorist in the whole of the Americas in the 20th century, who was also a Pan-Africanist. And then you had the red baiting, because some of them were socialist or communist, some of them were cultural nationalists, some of them were revolutionary nationalists, but they all held in common that our liberation, wherever we were in the diaspora, is connected to the liberation of Africa. And there are two broad elements of Pan-Africanism, one having started in the Americas. Again, people have different terminology, whether to call them Africans, Afro-descendants, Afro-Caribbeans, or what have you. Those are important debates to be had, but they all had in common the uplift of Africa. The second movement occurred more formally on the continent of Africa about the consolidation of Africa. And you see it today expressed in the Pan-African Parliament, which is in South Africa, which is the legislative arm of the African Union, something you can go online and look at, are expressions of the African Union's call for a sixth region to involve Africans in the diaspora across the Americas, as well as across Europe, including into Northern Europe, where you now have African descendants who are citizens of those countries in Europe who are members of parliament and local jurisdictions. So there are a lot of complexities to be unfolded here. Let me conclude my remarks by suggesting, at least from my vantage point, because we will invite your vantage points, not just your questions, but your critiques of analysis, your proposals, not just your questions. They shouldn't be to us, but our questions and observations should be to each other in this context. So let me just conclude my opening remarks by saying, for me, where I think some of the most resonant issues are. Some of you will have were likely attendance to the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, or at least are familiar with that. When the term Afro-descendant, when the term Afro-descendant emerged as a categorical term of usage out of the 2000 meeting in Argentina, where someone from Mundo Afro, an organization in Uruguay, Romero Rodriguez, said we entered as negros, negros meaning black, not Negroes in this, but meaning black from a Latin point of view, and we leave as Afro-descendants, a reflection that we came as Christians, as Muslims, as atheists, as socialists, as capitalists, as women. LGBTQ was not so much a democratic category being talked about at that time. Practicing various religions, some of us African religion, some of us atheists, but we all held in common, again, that historical factor of Pan-Africanism, those foundational elements, that our liberation, however we describe that, is also tied to our perspectives about the liberation of Africa as designated by Africans themselves. And on the continent of Africa, recall that there were many ideological differences. You had people who were involved in African socialism, like Julius Nyerere and like Nkrumah. You had others who wanted to remain tied to Europe. So a lot of people inhabit this term. And I would say coming out of the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, the two most controversial issues was one, the rights of Palestinians, and the issue of reparations. Today, both of those topics are resonant topics in the public space, the United Nations, and literally across the world. And so that, let me just read a quick quote and stop here from, we often think about Pan-Africanism again in the formalist terms, particularly of these men, but not so much in the more popular terms. And here again, I want to quote, let's see if I can find this quote by Mary McLeod Bethune, which I think is important for us to think about, not so much her as an individual figure, but just to see the commonness of how we have approached this. And I can't find the Mary Bethune, I'll find it, oh, here we are. She says, the drums of Africa still beat in my heart. They will not let me rest while there is a single Negro boy or girl without a chance to prove his worth. Although she's using the term Negro, you see what the commonality between Africa and whatever terminology we use. Then there's a term from Martin Luther King that I think is important. We are descendants of the Africans. Our heritage is Africa. We should never seek to break the ties, nor should the Africans. And then he goes on to talk about his invitation in 1957 to the independence movement, recognizing Ghana as the first republic to defeat colonialism. So this is a context, I think, of looking at the African Union today, of looking at AFRICOM, where we have a Black American, Colonel Austin, who heads the US military and the militarization of the continent of Africa, part to fight terrorism against fundamentalist Islam, but also to combat China coming onto the continent. Reparations and this new scramble for Africa, in which we have Kamala Harris, who now uplifts her Afro-Indo-Caribbean identity, who's talking about democracy in Ukraine, but has nothing to say about Haiti, the first Black republic, which is a great interlocutor of Pan-Africanism that people like Hugo Chavez recognize that without the Haitian Revolution, there would not have been the revolution of Simon Bolivar liberating several countries in Latin America. So these are contexts that I would ask you to consider. And after Bill speaks, then we will open it up to have your comments about what you think are the key issues in Pan-Africanism today, including critiques of any of the perspectives that we raise. We don't consider those personalized critiques. We're seeking understanding here. Thank you. Bill?
You're muted, Dean King. We need you to unmute. That's all. But we see you fine.
No matter how many times you go on Zoom, it's always happens. I was saying, thank you, James. That was great. And I really appreciate it. So just so you know, my first name is not Dean. My first name is Damani, my chosen name. So I want to start off by quoting the great American philosopher, Rodney King. Can't we all just get along? And we could, except because we are just one human family, but we have history behind us. We have greed in history and aggression and division and psychological damage. So we can't just all get along, because we have to deal with the realities of our life. So listen, before we continue, I want to ask you all a question, and you can put the answer in the chat. What was the most successful and largest non-church, multinational, African Black organization of the 20th century, and perhaps in history? And here's a hint. Its newspaper was in 3 languages. I'll put that question in the chat, and as we go along, y'all answer that.
Where's Marcus Garvey? Marcus Garvey, you in
Put it in the chat, please. Put it in the chat, please.
Linda,
Thank you. Thank you. So that history that I spoke of has meant that Black people, our history, our traditions, our heritage, our culture, our language, our spiritual beliefs have been devalued by others. And sadly, under centuries of oppression, as a people, we have internalized too much of that devaluation. This is a worldwide issue in the motherland and in all the lands in which our ancestors were dispersed. Now, you'll notice, like James, that I use African and Black interchangeably. Brother Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik Shabazz taught us that just because a cat has kittens in an oven, that don't make them biscuits. When Africans were stolen and trafficked to the US, Brazil, the Caribbean, Panama, etc., they were still African. When whites and Europeans moved to Argentina or Canada, they're still white. And when they have children, their children are white. Our ancestors in the US set up the African Free School in New York City and the African Free School in Boston. The original name of Cheyney University was the African Institute. A unit of the US Army in Louisiana in the Civil War was called Corps d'Afrique. Several of the first units of the so-called US colored troops in the Civil War were originally designated as AD, meaning African descent. And the African Brigade fought a valiant battle at Milliken's Bend in the Civil War. Our ancestors knew who they were, Africans. So terminology is very important. People are not slaves. That's a condition. People can be enslaved, but they remain people. When enslavement happened in biblical times, they were still people. When it happened in Roman times too, they were still people. And our ancestors remained people. They remained African people when they were enslaved. We have a rich and vibrant culture, as we all know, that others have stolen for centuries and even up until the present time. We have no need to imitate and mimic the culture of others, especially if it is toxic for us. Now, my purpose today is not to list all the problems and ills we suffer, but I will cite one that deserves more attention because I think it makes the point. That is women's health. I'll put the link in the chat a little bit later. Maternal mortality among Black women in the US is a tragedy and is not explained by income or social class. Black women die because of racism. I'll put the link, there's a current article in Salon magazine. And it shows y'all that the founding fathers of gynecology and founding fathers of this country believed that Black women did not feel pain. Think about that for a second. They thought we didn't feel pain. Now you tell me who was, quote, dehumanized, unquote. Was it the torturer or the person who was tortured? So society is infused with a delusion of white so-called supremacy and racism. And that racism is toxic for us, not only for us, but we feel the pain of it more pressing. So we are like, when I say we Black people, African people, we are like freshwater fish in salt water. So I looked it up. It says if freshwater fish are put in salt water, they lose water from their bodies due to the hypertonic environment. Their cells shrivel and die. But we've adapted. We've evolved and survived. But not all adaptations and evolution is good. When people adopt another people's culture, it's not necessarily bad. But when that new culture insists that you are less than in almost every way, it is deadly, literally. So Pan Africanism, and as James pointed out, it's defined in many ways. It's very simply an approach, a mindset, a framework, an ideology that insists that Black people, Africans, are equal to any others, that our culture is rich and valuable, that we should be self-determining, that means power, and that we reject any and all forms of racial domination, economic exploitation. But can't we just all get along? Yes, of course we can, but it must be on terms of mutual respect and equality. And I'm conclude with this. Brothers and sisters, we cannot come to the round table of humanity as poor second-rate carbon copies of someone else. Their culture is already represented at that table. We owe it to ourselves first. We owe it to ourselves first, and second to the world, to come as our authentic, full selves. Only then can we, with dignity and self-respect, make our best and most valuable contribution to the world. And so I see Pan-Africanism as the framework within which we can make that contribution, that we can regain our self-respect, that part of it that we have lost, that we can appreciate our own ancestors and their culture. So I'll conclude with that. And again, I apologize for my shaky picture. It's not me shaking like that, it's my bandwidth. So.
We hear you just fine, so no problem.
Thank you, Bill. So let's open this up as a participatory conversation to hear from other participants. Please identify yourself. I would say try to stay within 2 minutes. I realize that as interlocutors, we have been privileged, and that your comments and our questions need not be necessarily in relationship to what Bill and I have said. We want you to prime that conversation, but do not hesitate to critique or to ally yourself with anything that you may have heard. But this is about our multiple voices, because at the end, we want to take 25 minutes or so to talk about, of all of the resonant issues that will have been raised in our exchange, what do each of you think are the 2 issues most resonant for you, and why and how do you think we might go about it? So the floor is yours. The Zoom floor is yours.
I see Rod Laster. Go ahead, Rod.
Thank you so very much. Greetings, as well as a shade to Damani, which is also was my dean at Howard University, who happens to also be my cousin.
Oh.
So I say to the elders.
Hey, cuz.
Hey, cuz. I have a question, and all the elders that are on the line, and also greetings to Brother Counts, who is actually from Ocala. I'm from Miami, and HU alum. I have a question, and the question deals with the generation of leaders now. I feel that one of the things that was so beautiful was when you had somewhat of at least a conversation going on between the civil rights movement and Stokely Carmichael with Black Power as he was a student. But as we move forward, now that we're here, I feel that that conversation is not at least available to us in eyesight. So my question to the elders here is, how do we forge that conversation? I know since my days at Howard, I've tried to definitely stay in contact with Damani, aka Dean Keene, just to keep that conversation going, and he educates me. How is it that we can stay educated to the elders and not feel slighted? Because I feel like even when I've reached out to the elders, they have not responded back. It might be because of technology, it might be because they just tired and they like, I'm done. So y'all handle it. There seems to be some static within the passing of the baton. And we're watching a lot of them go out of service, having not passed the baton, and now we got to start back over. What can we do to keep this fire burning, moving forward, using the voice and the atmosphere and the movement that we're using it, going forward with that sound? Thank you so much.
Okay, elders, it's your turn to respond to the younger generation on this question.
If you're an elder and you have an answer, just go right ahead and unmute yourself and speak. We don't want this to all be on Damani and James. Olive, go ahead. I see your hand.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Helen, for such an excellent forum, and to the speakers. That question really touched me because I think that the answer is really right in front of our noses, but sometimes we fail to see it. And allow me just 2 seconds to give my context and then to specifically answer. Some time ago, there was a book published called Bowling Alone, and it addressed the issues of the decline in participation in organizations, in civil society across the United States. And somehow I think that our community has itself suffered from that change. And so as someone who heads an organization and can really, and the question resonates with me because I see the gap between those who work closely with me and the next generation and our desire to pass on, but the lack of the involvement in civil society, in organizations and groups from that younger generation that feels that connecting on social media, etc., is really the way to go. Yes, it is, but then in using social media, not exclusively, but to such a great degree, we lose the connection with the older generation. I think that volunteering for organizations that have been around, that have been focusing on these issues, is what will save the organizations, but also allow for the passing of the baton. I think that to me, from my own experience with my organization, I see that it's very difficult to get young volunteers to come on board. They really, the issues resonate with them, but it has to be delivered through media that they prefer. And that in that gap, I think we lose support. Thank you.
Other responses to that question and are to any issues that Bill Keene and I opened up with?
I would love to have Bob Brown respond to that if he's on.
Bob Brown, do we see Bob, Laura?
We saw his name earlier, but I
I'm
don't.
looking.
Yeah, I see him. Bob, did you want to unmute and respond to that, please?
Those who may not know
He's there.
him by name, let me just say that Bob Brown is a longtime soldier in the liberation struggle, a close comrade of Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael for decades and decades. And Bob is definitely one of my mentors.
Bob, you can turn on your camera if you wish, but you don't have to.
No,
Okay.
thank you. No, it's enough.
Yes.
I heard that Bill Damani was going to be on the program midnight last night. So I rescheduled my activities to be here. I don't want to talk too much, but let me just say one thing. The baton is being passed. It may not be to whom we want it to be, but the baton passes the moment we enter the crypt or the urn. It's an objective question that you see. I mean, I looked at the demonstration yesterday at the White House, and I saw 2 or 3 of the old people, and I saw hundreds of the young people. Let's just do a couple of things. The baton for Jesse Jackson has passed. He's quiet right now. And part of the reason is because he has so much tremendous victories at the last moment. His second son is in Congress, a passing of the baton. His older stepbrother has been released from 2 life sentences of COINTELPRO operations from the 1960s. So Noah is released. So Jesse, the baton has passed. There are other places and struggles where there's not agreement on who to pass it to, or the decimations that have gone on in our community. But we fought to open up opportunities for young people. I mean, I went to Howard, Damani know, for about a couple of months, and walked out without even signing out and whatnot. But I see hundreds, if not thousands, of Howard University students at all kinds of different positions. Not that I necessarily agree with them, but they're there in every side of the barricade. So I think it's not true that the baton has not been passed. I think it might be that we're not always in agreement with who it was passed to and how it was passed, but it has been passed. And it will be passed increasingly more as this 70 to 80 generation moves further and further off the screen. So I hope I'm diplomatic and nice, but it has been passed.
Is there another commentary, a question with regard to the question that our young adult here raised?
James Carter.
Okay,
Carter.
Hi,
James
everybody.
Carter.
Wait a minute, Linda, he wants to respond to this question on the floor. Go ahead, Mr. Carter. James Carter, go ahead.
I am a 59 graduate of Howard and a longtime colleague and dear friend of Bill Damani Keene. He and I have interacted for many, many years and decades, and we treasure that relationship. I want to commend to everybody very, very wonderful and important studies done by Professor Leo Hansberry, who taught at Howard perhaps close to 50 years. He knew so much African history and studied in Africa so long, he went to Harvard, get a PhD, and they couldn't give him one because they didn't know as much as he did. Secondly, so Chiang Diop. And thirdly, anthropological views and studies of genetic code, because she starts with and brings us down to
Mr. Carter, you're going in and out. If you can stay close to your mic, that would help.
genetic code, who writes about the origins of bipedal Africans who came out of Africa and walked around this continent and so on. So I communicated with Dean Keene not long ago how our white brothers deny their background, and they are genetic lineage Africans. But everybody walking the planet today is of African origin, whether they recognize it or not. But please, Leo Hansberry and Shekinah Diop and genetic code.
So let me just briefly comment as we also transition to one of the, I think, important issues that Damani raised, and that is that for the person who asked about this question of the passing of baton, there's another emergent concept with some young left-wing activists, many of whom are of African descent, Dominican background, Puerto Rican background, Afro-Latinos, if you will, who said to me that, James, we are not interested in the passing of the baton. We have emerged as a part of a new leadership, but we want you older people to run this race with us, although the baton is basically in our hands now. I think as a 76-year-old, that's a construction that I am really pleased to hear, that they're not just saying, give me your experiences or whatever you think is your wisdom and your knowledge, but run this race with us, but just be clear that we are the ones out and lead now. So I think that's a conception I would ask all of us older people with our children or with more formal political organizations, how do we continue to run this race with them, but to recognize that they have emerged in many instances a new young leadership. Bob Brown pointed out, I think, a very significant issue that I would also ask us to consider is that we may not always like the way that the baton is being passed. Under the Obama administration, now under the Biden administration, there are annual meetings of young African leaders who are brought here in really significant numbers in line with the US State Department to talk about enterprise, capital enterprise. How can African-American investment in Africa, they don't have a conception of Africa, they just say Africa as it is, which basically enters into a relationship with the elite of Africa, who are not providing for the most part, notwithstanding the history of racism and colonialism and ongoing neo-colonialism, are not providing for the most part self-determined perspectives on the continent of Africa, generally speaking. There are, of course, exceptions. So there's something called the Afro-Latino Forum, in which many people in the African diaspora, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Brazilians, in the last official census of Mexico, over 1 million Mexicans identified themselves as Afro-Mexicans. And as I said, Brazil is the largest African descendant or African population, your choice of terminology, in the Americas, with anywhere from around 53% identifying in the official census as Black and mixed race, over 100 million of them. The late Hugo Chavez, who identified as a Spaniard mixed with Indian, says that his grandmother was Black and began to identify himself as an Afro-descendant, and did policies of putting embassies on the continent of Africa and sending Black Afro Venezuelans there as ambassadors, people like Jesus Chucho Garcia, who is sort of considered the father of Afro epistemologia. So my point is that there are a number of examples across the ideological spectrum, but consider Bob Brown's point of which ideological perspective really relates mostly to the founders, if you will, of Pan Africanism, who were interested in a self-sustained, independent, self-determined Africa, not just an Africa that was doing the same old things that led to slavery and colonialism in itself, which was this so-called development of the New World, an economic system that came into a global relationship in which we were the primary source of labor as well as intellectual contributions, if you will. Damani raised the issue of terminology, and I think it's very important that we have some discussion about that. I would just kick it off by saying the terminological debate goes on. I think it's important to look at how people in various moments of history and today identify the terminology, but let us not lose sight if they have really a common interest in the uplift of the continent of Africa and our uplift in relationship to that. So the floor is open. Bill, you might want to comment on this.
And can I just say, before we go on to a different topic, that there's just one sliver of the elders that has not been addressed. And I wish Professor Linda Carter would jump in. And I think maybe I'm going to say what Steve would want to say, but I'll say this for myself because I can't read Linda's mind. As a child of the late 60s, with respect to the baton, I think the question for African-American born Black people born here in the US, the baton and who passes the baton and to whom the baton will pass, that question began in the mid 60s. And that question is still at play. For us, the question was, do you pass it to the leaders, the new leaders of the NAACP and so forth and so on? So that question is not just at play now with the greater African diaspora. It's been at play.
Can I jump in now?
Go ahead, Linda.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna go back a little bit for people to just to get some sense. I remember when I was younger, and I remember this whole thing about don't trust people over 30. And I went back to that a few weeks ago because that was sort of, you know, putting stuff in our mind. And then you had the senior buildings, which took out the elders out of the, you know, it moved them away, unlike where a lot of immigrants live, how they live in terms of having the elders there and passing on that wisdom as part of, you know, the intergenerational that some of us live and didn't know there was a word to say it. That was just our culture. So I'm saying that, you know, not trusting people over 30, this whole concept of senior buildings, taking the elders out of the community, COINTELPRO, which I'm not going to go into, 50 years, 2.5 generations of heroin and crack's influence on our communities. Compliments, for those who don't know, the FBI organized crime for the heroin and the CIA for the crack. And this whole Russian thing is part of what happened 40 years ago around the issues of crack. The other thing is the lack of living intergenerational. We didn't know there was such a word. That's just our culture. We lived intergenerational, the masses. The other part is the co-optation of Black music, because Black music served as our superpower. It also was the literature for the masses. When Mary and them were writing books and other people who couldn't read, and I had the privilege of living with people who came up from the South, who had been sharecroppers, who may not have had all the education, but they had common sense. So the music served to educate them. It was their literature. So recently, I find myself where there's a lot of young people, and I call this group Elders in Training, because it appears that they're seeking for eldership that was normal in our community we grew up. They're seeking it unknowingly. And, you know, they'll call up and say, can you give me a book list? Can you tell me what, you know, our generation's supposed to be doing? And it's really intergenerational conversations, but they don't necessarily know it. So if you're looking at 50 years, right, maybe 60 years of some of the stuff that I'm talking about, what happens is that we are in a position, and I say it's post-affirmative action, because even though white women benefited more than everybody else, it had substantial impact on us, because we moved from, they didn't want our money because we were dark. You know, our money wasn't, so it was not a big deal. Then after affirmative action, will you then have the expansion to some degree of a middle class? Not that we didn't have a middle class, and I'm sure you guys can speak to that, especially you, Mr. Early, because I know something about you. But we had, before it was the teachers, the preachers, the few lawyers, the doctors, but then it was expanded. And then they're like, wait a minute, they got expanded capital. We can't let them control it, right? So anyway, I've been meeting with them. And no, I haven't been meeting with them. They call me, I get all these calls, and I'm like, wait a minute, hold on a second. These are in effect 35 to 50. And, for those who are older, back in the day, a 17, they know now, a 17-year-old in 1972 is a 35-year-old now in terms of the level of maturity. So that's a whole nother issue. But my point is that what has happened as a result of this, what I see now, and from the conversations I've had with young people who just, I don't know what I'm doing, but for some reason they think I have something to offer. I've been meeting with them. I had a meeting, and I just wanted them to know there were other people who think like them about, what should they do? And going back, I don't know who said it, Mr. Keene or Mr. Early, in terms of, or somebody else, and talk. They don't want us to lead. They want us to all be together, right? Because they wouldn't be calling me if that's not the case. So what I was going to say is, as a result of this, what I see is we, the elder people who know better, those over 50, we have abandoned our culture. We've embraced somebody else's culture. Not only have we embraced it, but we're advancing it at the peril of our children and our own culture, right? So that's what I'm saying. And so when we see the kids out here, and people will talk about, and I hear a lot of older people, I'm almost finished, Helen.
All right.
We have a lot of people who complain about young people, right? But the whole reason, from my point, the whole reason why we get to live the age we do is to be able to pass on the information so that they can use it in their time, in their way. And, I think we're falling down the job. But the other thing, when we complain, I said, wait a minute, what are you doing? If you're living past 50, what are you doing to pass the information on? Again, they got to do it their way. But the fact that they want us to be involved, that they're reaching out, they definitely are looking for eldership. And whether they have parents, grandparents, somebody is not giving it to them. On top of the fact with the technology, and now with the COVID, that keeps us apart from each other. So that's my 20 cents.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter.
Ellen?
Yes.
Hi. Hi, this is Mike Smith.
Hey, Mike Smith, how are you?
Fine. Thank you for this forum and congratulations. Glad to see this is happening. First, I want to give a shout out to my brothers, Damani and Bob Brown. We were in the All African People's Revolutionary Party many years ago, and that's where I got my indoctrination, so to speak. Listen,
What's up, Shaka?
Hey, listen, about 2 weeks ago, Helen, my church did something similar to what you're doing today. Yeah. And we had on Mr. Tim Jenkins, who's one of the co-founders of SNCC. And he spoke very fervently about what they were doing down south as young people. And, in that discussion, I just had to think about it. It was a different time. Our families, most of our families grew up in a pretty solid family base, meaning a father and a mother. We didn't have drugs as rampant and violence as rampant as it is today. Most of our institutions, our traditional institutions, have a dearth of young people. They have a dearth of young people. Our churches, NAACP, all our traditional organizations have a dearth. But I was happy to hear from Tim Jenkins that the alumni of SNCC have organized, and they're reaching back and they're mentoring young people. So I was so encouraged with that. I'm going to put a link in the chat of the group that they've started. It's called the SNCC Digital Gateway. I encourage everyone to go to that site and see how they're doing just what you've been talking about so far, reaching back, bringing young folks along. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bill, Bill, you want to come back onto this?
I want to actually deal with something else. So let's let Jibo Sobukwe.
We'll very quickly
Keeps
do
up.
the last two questions. Nobody else, please raise your hand, and then we'll go to the next segment and we'll have you engage again. Jibo, you're next, help me hurry up. You're next, and then we'll move on. So go ahead, Jibo.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make a few comments. I'm Jibo Sobukwe, also 30-year plus former member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I worked with Bob Brown and Kwame Ture on political education in the party, and born in the Caribbean, the Dutch Caribbean, grew up there and moved here to PA for a long time. I just wanted to highlight a few points. One point I wanted to highlight was when James Early mentioned that there are many ideological factors that are attached to Pan-Africanism. And so I wanted to highlight some of those ideological factors, and just two really, that there are a few brands of Pan-Africanism. And you know, the party, for example, was always part of the left socialist brand of Pan-Africanism. And then of course there are other Pan-Africanisms that are not necessarily left at all, that don't advocate socialism. And this class struggle, if you will, is rooted back in Africa itself, and most exemplified between the two groups, the Casablanca group, which was the left Pan-Africanist group, and the Monrovia group, which was the more neo-colonial group. So, you know, in the Casablanca group, we had all the radical countries. We had Guinea, Ghana, Mali, you know, under Nkrumah, Sékou Touré, Modibo Keita. You know, we had Algeria. You know, we had Egypt, we had Morocco, we had Libya. You know, so these were the revolutionary, the more socialist-oriented group, Monrovia group. In fact, Abdel Gamal Nasser brought anti-Zionism to that group, you know, which the other group definitely didn't have, still doesn't have. So I just wanted to point out the, you know, following up on James Early's statement that, you know, there are ideological factors. Also, I wanted to point out on the comment about Nkrumah that Nkrumah advocated, just like Sékou Touré, scientific socialism. He even wrote a pamphlet called Two Myths, where he critiqued African socialism, the African socialism of Nyerere. It's also in the book called Revolutionary Path. So that's just a little side comment as well. And in regards to passing the baton, I agree with Bob that the baton is passed, you know, maybe not as much as we would like it to be, but it's passed. And I would like to emphasize James Early's points of how the baton, how great we are seeing when we analyze, first of all, when we analyze the passing of the baton, we have to analyze it in the realm of the battle of ideas and values. So ideas and values, you know, come to the fore to show us how strong African identity now has come up in Latin America, as James Early pointed out, you know, which I'm also witness to. I mean, now they have a big, strong Pan-African movement in Spain, for example, you know, and other countries, in the Netherlands, where I have family, you know, also. So Pan-Africanism is not only to be assessed, not only in this country, but internationally. And, you know, in this country, we have to come down to basics. It's a battle of values. We need a revolution of values like King talked about. Even our self-love we had in the 60s. We have to show our youth that, you know, that we're proud people, that our history is valuable, and that we have to help each other. and it gets down to real basic aspects. So, and we have to join organizations, and we have a responsibility to educate ourselves, especially about international Black people internationally, Africans internationally. So that I'll conclude with those comments. Thank you very much for having this program.
I'm sorry, Jibo, I only realized at the end that you had your camera on. Thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you, brother.
We
Thank
have
you.
one more hand raised, and we're going to get to that person. Then we're going to move back, program back to Mr. Early and Damani. I said Damani. Are you proud of me? Miss Bay, I don't know if that's, I'm sorry, I'm looking for the name.
Yes, good afternoon, Helen, and thank you so much, everyone, for having this forum. It's pronounced Faraya. If you were in the Middle East, you would roll your tongue and say Huria, but it's Haraya. My focus, I want to go back to the brother who was making the comments on economics. I just wanted to put this bug out there. I know it's already out there, but for everyone to stay focused on this failing banking system, the banking system that was formed off the backs of our slave labor is failing, which proves that you cannot start an economy or a country off of a generation of slaves. But we need to start putting some focus on things like this new discovered wealth in Uganda, where they just discovered 700, I think, trillion in gold, and forming an independent banking system, where we can maybe take part of our wealth, leave it here in this banking system, but form an independent banking system, because this country has the ability to freeze your monies. I've seen large Black organizations announce that their funds were frozen and they couldn't move forward. So I just wanted to put that bug out there, and especially to the young people. Most of us are past the age of having a job or going out to get a job, but they're just starting in their careers. To keep that in mind, that you must have some type of banking system that is not tied into this banking system. I don't have the ins and outs of how to do it. You wouldn't have an FDIC, which as of today, the FDIC is not of any value anyway. But I just wanted to share that we need to contact those of us who have contacts with African governments and start. My life is surrounded around promoting Black expos for Black businesses. And that is our pot of gold right there, these small Black businesses. If we have to call on anybody for funds, we have to call on them. So peace and blessings. And again, I'm learning a lot. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to James and Damani again.
Damani, before I open up a new arena, are there comments you want to make on anything that's been said?
Not really so much, but I do want to address something. I don't want us to proceed as if everybody on the call has warmly embraced Pan Africanism. Being an African, I think we need to talk about this a little bit. And so I want to quote that great philosopher Rodney King once again. Can't we all get along? But in the context of can't we Black people all get along? And of course the answer is yes. And we can get along better than the Russians and the Ukrainians, better than the British and the Irish, better than the Shiites and the Sunni, better than the Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland, or South and North Korea, or the political parties in Israel. So, sometimes we have these idealistic notions about, unity, we're all together, we don't have any disagreements, we're just smooth and we're rolling along without any problems. No, that's not the way the world works. But we have the capacity and have proven it in history that we can get along, that we can work together. But the reason I'm raising this is that, in my opinion, I won't say in my humble opinion, in my opinion, we hurt ourselves if we divide ourselves based on colonially imposed country borders or religion or skin color. Colorism is about the sickest thing I know of, or class or social status, or what century you or your ancestors arrived in a particular country. You know, in South Africa under apartheid, the white rulers divided us by ethnic group, skin color, hair texture, parentage, or language, and said the numbers were small for each group. But when they counted their own population, they combined the Dutch, the English, and any other European who was in there and called them white. Eventually, struggle prevailed and apartheid was defeated. Of course, we all know the economic realities have changed very little. So I'm saying that Pan-Africanism is a unifying force that has helped us and will help us liberate ourselves. So I've noticed in the chat, most of you got the answer correctly. The largest non-church international Black African organization was the UNIA, Marcus Garvey, United Negro Improvement Association. I want to tell you that there was 64 chapters of the UNIA in Louisiana alone. Dozens of chapters in Cuba. And I just found out, my cousin, when she saw the invitation, she emailed me this morning to tell me that one of our ancestors in our family was the treasurer of the UNIA in Costa Rica. So, but the UNIA was targeted. It was attacked from all sides, including from the inside. But its achievements are unmatched. And it was based on Pan-Africanism. Now I want to share this. It was a surprise to me, but Dr. Tyreen Wright makes an excellent case. And I'll say it this way, even Booker T. Washington was a Pan-Africanist. I'll link her short video where she discusses that a bit in the chat just now. Her book is called Booker T. Washington and Africa, The Making of a Pan-Africanist. You can check YouTube for her other videos, and you might want to check her book. So just think for a moment that how three key figures in our history in the US opposed each other, but they all turned out to be Pan-Africanists. W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Booker T. Washington. Imagine that. And of course, we know Kwame Ture. Stokely's been mentioned several times, my friend and compatriot. Queen Mother Moore, John Henry Clark, and those in the motherland like Nkrumah Kenyatta, Sekou Touré Sankara, Casely Hayford, properly known as Ekra Ajuma, Ajay Akoto, my late and great friend in DC, and other very important but less known Pan-African warriors. A couple of them on the call: Bob Brown, Bambosi, Rafiki, Sister Mawusi Toure, Mwalima Kita, Gary Brown, Wambagamba, the late Lamin Janha from Gambia, the late Ahmed Mbalia, also known as Fletcher Smith from DC, Jared Ball, so many others. And then all those brothers and sisters from the Caribbean, like Henry Sylvester Williams, who helped organize the first Pan-African Congress in London. So when we look at our history, doesn't it make sense to examine the philosophy and ideology that undergirded our people's most successful organization, designed not to fit in with our oppressor, but to be self-determining and independent? Just wanted to leave that thought.
I came on screen because I wanted to thank you for raising the elephant in the room that we probably don't talk enough about, that there are people who are opposed to or don't support, I should say, Pan-Africanism, and they're very vocal and they're a part of our community too. So I'm sure that there are some folks on the call who might be of that position. So I want you to know that your voice is welcome here too. And I do want us to talk about the divide that is very much, very real amongst us. And, you know, when I think of Pan Africanism, I think of a oneness and the whole, you know, we are one, which is my weekly passcode. So now you know to get into these calls, because I really believe that. But I also recognize that there are things that divide us. And I do recognize, as Damani has said, that it's by design, you know, and we all know that, but still we fall victim to it. So I'm just going to bow out and ask you to please address the elephant in the room, if you can. And, you know, are we one? Do we share the same agenda? Are we opposing one another? When I say we, I mean Black folks, whether they're, you know, Black Americans and West Indians, Black Americans and Africans, or whatever the case may be. It's the elephant in the room. So I hope that we will address that too today. So I'm going to go off screen and just leave that as a nugget. Thank you.
Brother Damani.
Go ahead.
David. Greetings. Excuse me for the intrusion, but the sister's invitation was clear in terms of the dialectic of this conversation. My name is David Littles. I'm from Washington, D.C., Southeast D.C., right over from the center. I went to University of D.C., which is the poor cousin of Howard. And I'm a former party pre-cadre, brought into the party during the Great Purge in 72 or 4, what I think I've forgotten. Bob Brown was over the organization at that point. I'm still alive and active. I live in Panama with Damani as a far distant neighbor. I moved to Accra, Ghana in 2001. My point is, there is something moving dozens, looks like hundreds of young Black Americans to Ghana. There's this constant flow. They're popping up all over YouTube and everything. I listen and I follow some of their threads. This begs a bigger question. You should always, as we say in our colloquialisms, you should always be careful of what you ask for, all right? And on the back of that, everything dark ain't Black, all right? How did we come to this position of being African, Black, Pan-African, whatever as Bill say, whatever, oh, excuse me, Bill, I called you Bill, whatever Damani said about your terminology of use, but everything dark ain't Black. And we had a specific elevation of consciousness during the 70s in which a brother or a sister was first alerted to their condition, awareness. Then secondly, we then began to look at the positions we took on those conditions as so-called Black people in America. Then, as a brother or sister elevated in consciousness and became conscious, then we said they were woke. That's where the conversation comes from about their woke. They take something that was our slang and appropriate it and give it this negative connotation. But the point is that we have this racial division because of the history that you know of and that you already mentioned of colonialism. All right, but how do you change something that you use constantly? That's us. And our Blackness is a conditioned response to whiteness. Prior to the 16th century, there was no reference of Blackness, African among the tribal people of Africa. Give me a quote if I'm wrong.
Oh, you're
All
right.
right, I know I'm right. You know I'm a dedicated researcher. I'm a party member for life. I'm ready for the revolution. I'm down with the struggle. All right. But I also understand that in this confusion, we're not applying our dialectical understanding of the situation in the way that we were trained to do. I was a party member in DC. I mean, I got most of my radicalization at that start, but I picked up the rest of my radicalization in Vietnam and Korea in the war camps.
So let's take up your, let's take up.
Go ahead.
your-
I'm sorry.
No,
I go
no,
like that.
No. So let's take up your question. This framework has been looking back, looking forward. And you bring a very important point about how the term Blackness emerges. I'd ask all of us to consider this, that on the continent of Africa, of the 6,000 or so living languages, most of those languages are in the continent of Africa today. The largest number are probably in Asia. I raised the question of language to suggest that should we not consider there was never one Africa. Africa was comprised of thousands, and there are thousands of languages on the continent of Africa today. Long before Europeans blended into being quote unquote white or even Europeans by that terminology, on the continent of Africa, there was human conflict. Human conflict is something natural, if you will, among the human species. And so the notion that somehow there was a utopian of freedom, women having total liberties versus men, are LGBTQ people who didn't just emerge in the last 25 or 50 years. They either were brought here by the stork, if one looks at it that way, or climbed down from the trees, as I tend to look at. So there was always this diversity. And this brings us back to Brother Subokwe's comment about the Monrovia group and the Casablanca group. And it brings us then to the present. So we have a Black Colonel Austin leading the African on the continent of Africa. We have a vice president who's Indo-Caribbean Black, leading the struggle against, in Ukraine, against the Russians, but not addressing the issues of Cuba or the issues of Haiti. So which Pan-African road, they all will argue that this is for the uplift of Africans, and they will all invoke their heritage to Africa. So let's open up this broader to see which roads of contemporary expressions of Pan-Africanism do people think are most important. The question of banking, economics and banking has been brought up by our sister, and there are other elements. So let's see what.
You accidentally muted yourself, Mr. Early.
So let's consider how people think we should ground ourselves ideologically and in specific projects, given the various roads of Pan-Africanism, some which are about enterprise in Africa, some which are about women in Africa, some which are about grassroots organization, some of which are about socialism. Consider that in the last several years in the United States, the polls that have been done, over about 43% of young adult people identify themselves with the term socialism. My guess is 99.9% of them have never read a word, but it is something about their views about humanity, that they want to see a different kind of sense of justice engagement. I consider that the various people under the rubric of Black Lives Matter, there was a global reaction to our young Black people out in the streets with various ideological perspectives who got the attention of the entire world, who stood up not only to say, we support Black people in their defense, but we don't want to live in this kind of world that we're living in. I think these are some of the considerations of which avenues of Pan-Africanism, given what Brother David Littles has raised, what Brother Bob Brown has raised, Brother Subukwe has raised, and our sister, I tried to write it down so that I could pronounce it, who gave us her name and says if it was in Arabic. I'm sorry, I can't find my note on it, but she raised the issue. The very important issue of economics.
Mariah.
Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is open. Which roads of Pan-Africanism today is the sort of the question.
Okay, since I intruded, let me go ahead with it. It can't be the one we're traveling. The dialectic does not allow it. We cannot get up every day and do the same thing and expect change. You know exactly what they call that, craziness. So how do we get back in our minds? We first have to discover where our minds are and the conditions of our mind and the training of our minds. I'm a technical person, so you've heard this terminology of chat GPT, all right? Chat GPT is this artificial intelligence that is programmed to respond like a person, all right? I use it constantly. I'm not afraid of it. I do understand its drive and where it probably will wind up. But the point is, how do we retrain our minds? Now, we went through the Black school shoelace, the shoelace back in the 70s, the Black schools, the independent Black school movement. Black Seeds was in DC. We went through the Black bookstores. We went through Black studies in the colleges, all for the purposes of conditioning our minds toward unity. That's what it was for, all right? My greatest impression was from Maulana Ron Karenga. Karenga explained it culturally in the division of the political nationalists versus the cultural nationalists. And it is from his point of view that I began to understand that they were not something different. They were a blended solution. All right. So somebody introduced the idea of our music being the trumpet of our sayings and beliefs. Yes. And this is a good thing and a bad thing. We can't kill rap. I want to kill it, but we can't kill it. It's been around for 40 years. It won't go away. All right. But the messages, yes, that's exactly it. It's the messages. I'm sitting in a cafe in Accra, Ghana, and a boy comes walking down the street with a hoodie on, red hat, red band on his head, pants hanging down. It's 90 degrees out there, but he had on Timberlands. And he gets up to me and I recognize that the red band was a rebel flag. All right. So he's looking like Tupac with a rebel flag. So I stop him. I said, young brother, I introduced myself, told him I would be interested in buying his band. And he said, no, not my band. No, mine. I said, well, here's $5. What do you think? He said, okay, here, my man, take the band. I took it, ripped it up, threw it on the ground and stomped on it. He said, why you throw? Because in your unconsciousness, you have approached me in a manner that is offensive, that you basically gave me no choice. I had to make explanation that this flag did not represent my viewpoint, and for you to use it the first time is forgivable, but if I see you a second time. So this idea of consciousness, levels of consciousness, how the party raised us in study groups, how we studied to get to some position. How then do we do this in the public schools, in our households, right? So I'll end my little diatribe by saying that revolution of the mind is the first battle. That's the first strike. Once you have the mind liberated, then it's revolution in the house and in the family, and from there in the neighborhood, and from the neighborhood to the state, and from the state to the country.
Okay, brother, thank you.
Thank you.
So let's take Brother David's point and open it up to others. And I would ask us to consider, there is one orientation of how dark the sky is. And of course, the sky is always dark, but there's little discussion about the pinheads of light that we have created over hundreds and hundreds of years since slavery and colonialism, and through various struggles that we have created, no matter how dark the sky is. So how do we look at those points of light that have been created and talk about how to move from a point of view of strength rather from the point of view of deficit on this issue of our relationship to our uplift and justice in relationship to the independence and justice on the continent of Africa, the sort of foundational elements of Pan Africanism, no matter who defines it, but different ideological and political ways of going about it. And that's the question before our panel. We have another 27 minutes less so to go. Let's talk about that and then transition into where do we go from here.
So I'm going to call out some folks that I know on this call who I know have an opinion and they're being quiet for whatever reason. Bill Davis, Carl Johnson. I'd like to hear Wayne Young. Can we hear from you all about what you're thinking about today and the question that's on the table?
But silence speaks
Loud.
Well, as they say, nature
I've been
affords
trying to
a
jump,
vacuum.
I can't get on.
Oh, go ahead, Ms. Tyus. Ms. Tyus, we hear you.
Oh, okay, all right. Hi, Damani.
Hey,
Hi,
Ansa.
sweetheart. How are you? We've known each other since our children were babies.
And now they have grandchildren.
I know. You know, but one thing that I wanted to mention about passing on the baton is that my grandchildren and my children and my grandchildren have participated in puberty rights and rites of passage programs. And that's something that we really, really need to horn in on. And I'm talking about children from the ages of 12 to say 21. Generally is between 12 and 18. But it does make a difference in terms of developing the mindsets of who we are as Pan Africanists. And it has to start young. It cannot start at 25 to 35 or 50. It has to start young. And that,
don't be pessimistic, Ansa. Old people can learn new tricks.
Well, that is true. That is true. Old people can learn new tricks, but we're talking about passing on the baton. And, you know, I like the idea of what the brother said, revolution of the mind. And we've got to start doing that when our children are young, when they are, you know, in their formative years, and they can begin to see themselves as Africans. And, you know, and not only see themselves as Africans, but present them to the world as Africans. And so I just want to bring that up. I think everybody else is talking about, you know, different things and so forth and so on. But I really think it needs to be, we all need to, no matter what organization you're in, is trying to develop ways where we can get to our young people, do the, you know, the puberty rites, do the past the coming of age. And I do believe it really, really has made a difference for my children as well as my grandchildren. And thank you. Good to see you, Damani. Tell Ife I said hello.
Thank you for that question, Tyus, response. And one of the questions that I put in the chats was, have we failed the, you know, the next generation by not keeping our history and information about the struggle up front? Are we dealing with young people who don't have an appreciation for how we came to be? I mean, going all the way back. So I don't know.
Can I address that?
Yes.
I'd like to address that because I think we can always look back and say we could have done better, and we could have, and we should have. But Kwame Ture said something that I'll paraphrase here because I think it's relevant. He said, to analyze a situation without taking into account the actions of the enemy is by definition incomplete. And so we have to realize that we have been opposed in every effort that we have made as a people since we arrived here in the West and at home on the continent. And if it's mass media, if it's COINTELPRO, and some people believe that COINTELPRO ended some decades ago, but I got news for you. It's still underway. So all of the organizations that have been undermined, sabotaged, infiltrated, betrayed, and destroyed were our efforts to do exactly what you were talking about, Helen, to have we done as much as we could? No, we should have done more. We definitely should have done more. But we were also ourselves living in the struggle, not thinking about, you know, the next stage. We were trying to make our way in the struggle, trying to make sense of what was happening around us. But I think we need to keep in mind that it's not just our efforts that are at play.
So I want us to, again, in regards to that, you know, there again, two orientations. Is the glass half empty or half full? Every generation has raised this question about the generation before or after it. We have the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, an extraordinary resource that was put together by Black people. Black people did that. Some of them have been referenced. Joseph Harris, who's now 80 some odd years old, the father of Africana studies, trained Africans to study themselves. This happened at Howard University. It didn't happen on the continent of Africa. Another expression of TransAfrica, of Pan Africanism. We have the Schomburg Center. Schomburg was not a German. He was a Black Puerto Rican that Du Bois rejected because he didn't have the same kind of high education, whose personal collection led to the New York Public Library System, making that a part of the New York Public Library System. That's the Schomburg Center, one of the most important research. Black people did this from the diaspora. Du Bois joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana and started a center there. So we have many, many things that we have built that we do know about ourselves, but there is a tendency to talk about the deficit, not talk about the accumulated strengths in which we then face other deficits. We have the independent school movement that Sister Tice was just talking about. My children went to those schools, didn't go for the long time that your children may have gone, but yes, those were foundational elements. We have Black universities, colleges and universities where thousands of young Black people are going every year. I want to refer you to this book by a 36-year-old PhD at Howard University, Josh Myers, and it's called Of Black Study, who's talking about how have Black people always studied themselves from the grassroots up to the intellectual proposition. So my point is that we have got tons and tons of things that we have accumulated over 500-600 years out here in the diaspora, and not to mention on the continent of Africa. I could go through any number of centers that Africans have built. We need to give attention to those strengths that we've accumulated in order to face our deficits. That's one thing. We have a question from our sister, Claudette Johnson Berry. Would you raise your question with us? It's on the chat, but would you tell us what your question is? Is she still?
I'm here.
Hi.
Okay, yeah, please.
We have heard so many different flavors of Pan Africanism and so many different destinations that our lineage have come from. And on the continent today, there are different countries that have different roots and different cultural perspective. So my question is, how do we define what's an African? Because I know white folks that I work with currently in corporate who are from South Africa, and they consider themselves Africans. So is African in what definition? What is the definition of an African?
Important question that Brother Littles and Brother Subukwe have made commentary on, but let's see if there are others who have response to that question who we have not heard from.
Well, Carl is on screen with us. Carl, you had a question. I don't know if you wanted to address that or something else.
Oh, yeah. I just want to address, how you doing? I'm Carl Johnson, historian at Ramapo College. I've been studying since 2013 the new Back to Africa movement. Like it or not, there is a Back to Africa movement. And like it or not, it's being led by popular culture. Hip hop artists like Akon, Jay-Z, Beyonce, whenever they go to Nigeria or Senegal to perform, it makes people, youth from America and the African diaspora go back and forth, go to visit Africa. So this battle, what you're talking about, I hate making predictions. I'm a historian. I think it's going to happen on the continent because Africa is the place, like it or not, that has all the most resources, the water and everything. What's going to happen is that some people in the West, hopefully it'll be very little, they're going to go down with their masters. They ain't going to want to leave. I don't know. It's going to be sometime in the future. They're going to stay and go down with the ship. and others are just going to leave. And this battle, consciousness and stuff is going to happen on the continent of Africa. It's already happening and it's being led by popular culture. All movements are led by popular culture, like it or not. Even the civil rights movement with Jackie Robinson. The average person don't have time to be super intellectuals like us. I'm a professor. So like that brother brought up with those YouTube videos and stuff like that, there's a whole lot of people that's leaving. You don't have to tell them leave, but the idea of their consciousness and what's gonna happen with the continent of Africa, because you got all these ascending and declining superpowers. You got the declining superpowers with England, the US, then you got the ascending ones with maybe South Africa, maybe Russia again, and China. But I think the struggle is going to be on the continent of Africa. I think you all already laid the foundation, like or not. I mean, you laid the foundation. We can always do more. But people don't see Africa the same way. People see Africa as a way that, you know, you can go on a nice vacation. You can take Ethiopia Airlines. You don't have to use a European Airlines anymore. You can take Ethiopian Airlines. They got a new terminal in Togo, you know. You know, you can get to Africa at a reasonable price. You know, you can be there in 12 to 24 hours. The young people know it. They're on the internet. So I just like to say, I love hearing all what you're saying. And I appreciate all the elders, all you do. I think that you did a wonderful job. You know, it's going to happen. Okay.
Thank you so much. Demetrius, did you want, your hand was up. Are you still interested in speaking?
Good afternoon, everyone. I thank the elders, particularly the just not elder, but scholars, Dean Keene, you know, Dr. Early, and also Helen for bringing this this discussion on. There was so many things that was mentioned. And I think the most important thing is when we address one another, I think we have to understand, just like how if we are in the States or if I'm in Ghana, everyone can look up at the moon and understand that that's the moon no matter where we are on the planet. And the thing is, we have to sometimes look up, as the light that was mentioned earlier, we have to look up and agree that it's a sky that we're looking at, number one, rather than the differences. And when I get in conversations with brothers, whether they're Hebrew Israelites, Nation of Islam, or other brothers, a lot of times, you know, the first thing they ask is, you know, who are you, what you all about? And then what we try to do is we try to poke holes. And my conversation with them is Black folks are everywhere and everything, and we can't pigeonhole each other. And just like was mentioned earlier, where the continent of Africa had thousands and still have thousands of languages, because people don't refer to God in the same way, don't mean that there's thousands of gods that we worship. Because when we look at each other, we are obviously made by the same God. But we have to understand that we are on different paths, but going in the same direction. You know, I travel back and forth to Ghana, and Helen and I always talk about Ghana, the pros and cons. And Brother David Little, he looks familiar to me as well in visiting Ghana. I know he's a part of the diasporans there in Ghana, but I too seen Ghanaians, one Ghanaian brother who was wearing a Confederate flag hat. And we have to be very patient because colonialism is a hell of a drug, just like enslavement of our people was a hell of a drug and still is.
Excuse me, brother. Excuse me, brother. You brought up a very relevant point. The rebel cap or scarf or whatever rebel or paraphernalia wasn't brought by the whites, it was brought by the rappers.
Well, whether it was brought, when I spoke to the Ghanaian, he thought it was an American flag because he's seen red, white, and blue. And what I try to do is I try to get a sense of some of our misunderstandings, because some of us wear kente, some of us wear mud cloth, and there's certain weaves and designs that have a certain meaning that we don't know. And even in, you know, I have a fiance, you know, in Ghana, and even talking about naming a child. I said, oh, she said, you have the right to name the child. So I'm looking up Ghanaian names. So I choose a Ghanaian name. And she says, no. I can't name my child after Ga or Ashanti or the Fulani name, because my people up north are going to ask, why are you naming this child this name? So I had to understand, I'm thinking, but all of that in regards to the division is about education. It's about educating one another about each other, because we can call ourselves Pan Africanists, but we can't sit in a philosophy and think we're going to quote unquote pan or bridge to the other side without an understanding. Just like I used to run track, and when you pass the baton, when we were in a relay, we practiced passing the baton. You just didn't throw the baton to anyone else or assume that somebody was going to magically grab the baton. And me as a young person, I had to shut my mouth and understand that I had to step on some rocks that were already placed before me, because I don't take pride in stepping in the water and drying myself off and saying how wonderful I was because I dried myself off and I pull my boots up. No, I cannot take pride in that. I take pride in being able to lay out rocks further for the next generation. So, that's all my comments. I don't want to take all the, but it's much more I would like to say and comment on, but I'm very grateful and thankful that, this conversation is being had.
Thank you.
So we've got about 6 minutes, and we could go a little longer if we want to, but let's, other people who have not either made a comment or raised a question or a critique or a proposal, let us hear from you.
May I speak?
Go ahead, Ms. Johnson, go right ahead.
I just came in and I'm so sorry I missed everything, but I am so happy to see the brotherhood on the call. It really warms my heart. And my brother lived in the Gambia for 30 years. My other brother went to Sokoto, and most of the family have all married African women or African men, because the majority of them are Muslim. So much of what you're saying, and even my mother, who went to Africa and stayed 3 months, and she's no longer in her body. So somehow we were connected to Africa. Don't ask why, don't know why, but we have. And I'm so grateful to hear the comments and to see the brotherhood. Peace and blessings.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, my sister. James, I'd like
go ahead, Damani.
to chime in, because I think we've spoken of Pan Africanism in some senses at a very high level of intellect and scholarship and history and everything. I'd like to talk about it on the ground, because I think this is where some of the questions that people had come to play. Years ago in my other life as Dean for Residence Life at Howard, my assistant, Reverend James Coleman, and I had a session for our student staff. And we had, I'm proud to say, we had a very diverse student staff. We had brothers and sisters from the continent, from the Caribbean, from the US, a couple from United Kingdom. And we divided them up into those groups. And so we had the US students born and raised in the US, and those from the Caribbean and from the continent, and those who were first generation born in the US, but whose parents were from the continent or the Caribbean. And we asked them to have a conversation first among themselves within each group to talk about the other two groups. And then all three groups came back and they reported. And each group said that they believed that at least one or both of the other two groups thought they were better than us. And it was just so revealing. And I think that it gave those students an insight, because the students from the continent especially are told quite literally, don't associate yourself with African Americans. They bad people. And they see the Hollywood images of the gangsters, and nowadays, hate to say it, the gangster rap And that's their image of who Africans born in the States are. And so I think we have a lot of work to do.
Let me jump in.
Let me go through this. So, you know, a brother approached Malcolm one time and said, "Man, I ain't got nothing. I ain't left nothing in Africa." And Malcolm said, "Brother, you left your mind in Africa." And in some ways it's true. So, you know, to me, Pan Africanism is something that, you know, we can practice every day. We need to learn our history as a global people, and we can be intentional about including other Black people from different geographical origins in our personal interactions, organizational events, and so on. So, hey, quick question. You can raise your hand if you want. How many people on the call have been to a Chinese restaurant? You can raise your hand. How many people have been to an Italian restaurant? Did you feel, you know, out of sorts? You know, this was something unusual for you. You had to get out of your comfort zone to go there? Now, how many people, raise your hand if you want to, have been to an African restaurant? And how many people have been to a Caribbean restaurant, if you're from the States? So, you know, my point is that we have opportunities. I like all those hands up, cool. So we have opportunities for interaction. You know, why not go to an African restaurant and start up a friendly conversation with the folks at the next table? You know, something like, "Hey, this is my first time here. What's good on the menu?" You know, start a conversation, ask some questions, be willing to answer some questions. We can center our attention on events that are impacting African people worldwide. Right now is the impact of Cyclone Freddy in Southeast Africa, Malawi especially. It's been devastating. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been killed by that. It doesn't make the front page of the news because that's not their concern, but that should be our concern. We can be inclusive on our social media posts about events and people of the African world. So I think in these small ways, I've always looked at it this way. These are small building blocks of unity that we can put together. Everybody bring a brick to the enterprise of building Pan-Africanism, because it's got to be also, you know, from the bottom up as well as organizational. And of course, other people have said, and I want to emphasize it too, being part of an organization is very important. An organization that is conscious, I don't even want to use the current slang, but is conscious and that is working intentionally on behalf of the uplift of African people. And I'll finish by saying Helen was kind enough to mention our book, Clandestine, at the beginning. We wrote a Pan-African book. And so when you read our book, you know, you'll see references to Haiti and Benin and the US South, Jamaica, Panama, and the people there and what they're doing, because that's what's important to us. So I'll end with that.
So,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Mr. Helen.
Go ahead, Larry. I was gonna say all these hands, I don't know if these people's hands are up from the from talking about the restaurants, or they're up because they have questions.
Oh, so let's take, what are there, 3 or 4 hands up? Let's take the last round all together and then summarize and
So I see some new hands. So let's Miss A. Hawthorne, is your hand up because you have a question?
Yes, I was trying to put it down, but I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see what to do.
Okay, I do it for you, no problem. A. Khalil Day, did you have something you wanted to add? Or is your hand up from the question, from the restaurant question? I don't know. Okay. All right, I can't tell Dean Keene, you just blew my whole program here. I see Bill Davis. Bill Davis, I'm bringing you in. What you got, Bill?
I am curious, and unfortunately, I missed part of the conversation. If there was any discussion about what Ron Daniels and the Institute of the Black World is doing in Baltimore next month on the issue of reparations. Maya Motley, I'm the president of Ghana. A bunch of different people are all going to be there, and so and I heard one of the brothers said we're talking about what we're going to do on the ground. So I know that there have been different states, different environments that have been raising this reparations. So unfortunately, I had to step out for a minute. So I don't know if that topic was addressed, but I'd be curious to hear what people are recommending.
If I might, thank you, Brother Davis. This is, it's actually in my notes. This is James Early speaking. So the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, founder director Ron Daniels, head of communication Don Rojas, who is from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but we know Don Rojas mostly through his work with the late great New Jewel movement in Grenada with Maurice Bishop, which was another expression of Pan Africanism. So the Institute of the Black World 21st Century is at the center of the reparations network. It is not the center, but it is a network of networks in the United States involving those historic people who have fought from the margin to bring reparatory justice into the center of local and state policy. Some of you may see what's going on in California about reparations are going on in Detroit. It is connected to the most important development reparations movement in the entire world, which is going on in the Caribbean, both with civil society or citizens movements across the Caribbean, and a unity of all of the CARICOM Black Anglo-speaking countries who have raised that. The reparations movement is now a part of the community of Latin America and Caribbean integration, in which Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves is the new president of that group. That is an initiative started by the late President Hugo Chavez, who also identified himself, not in addition to being a mestizo, Spanish and Indian, identified himself also as an Afro descendant, along with Fidel Castro. So the Institute of Black World 21st Century on April 19th will be, and I think it's maybe 3 days of the state of the Black world, in which the reparations question is central among other questions. Mia Moore Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who is taking on the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly about the debt that comes out of colonialism and neo-colonialism on these new independent republics, remembering that the Caribbean republics became independent in the 1960s, whereas the first country to defeat the Spanish in the hemisphere was Simón Bolívar, but who could only do that because he went to Haiti to ask President Pétion, the representative of these ex-enslaved Africans who defeated Napoleon's army, to give him men and boats. And so Hugo Chavez understood that linkage and began to talk about the debt to Haiti. So Mia Moore Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, will be there. Francia Marquez, I'm not sure who is the Afro-descendant Colombian. Remember that when I use this term Afro-descendant, Colombia has 3 distinct ethnic Black groups. They may all look alike, but the Palenquero speakers who are also Spanish speakers. They're the people who have collective land histories, and they're the people who are just individuals who come from various groups. So one terminology does not easily fit. And I think the instruction for us here is, how do people identify themselves about the common, their relationship to Africa and the common uplift of Africa in their own ways, rather than what terminology I might want to impose on them? How do they express themselves? There are others. So go to the Institute of Black World's website, sign up for that. It starts April 19th, and I think it runs for about 3 days. I'll conclude by saying, I come out of the Marxist-Leninist left. I still am very active in that. The significance of the Institute of the Black World for me, though, is that it engages broad sectors of the mass Black community, whether you're in the religious community, the small enterprise community, whether you are formal Pan Africanists or AARP or whatever you are, they really represent a more mass sociology, if you will, than almost any organization in the Black community that I can think of. I could raise my critical perspectives, but those are tertiary. There's always something to critique. The question is, what are the pinheads of light? And this is one of our important pinheads of light that comes out of the Black Convention movement. When he was Leroy Jones and then Amiri Baraka and others who were elected officials, in which across ideological boundaries, people came together. This was another expression of the diversity of African people or African descent people or people who call themselves Black people. The late Rayford Logan called himself a Negro and would not let us use the term Black in his class. And then I discovered he was the right-hand assistant to W.E. Du Bois at the Manchester Conference. He was one of the leading voices in the United States to run the United States out of Haiti. He called himself a Negro, we called ourselves Black. We were trying to work on the same project, but we had these terminological differences. And if we had focused only on those, we would have missed the point of what was our common unity. So thank you so much for bringing up the Institute of the Black World. I think it is now 6:09. We have heard about the younger generation saying pass the baton. We've heard a brother who ran track, I think, who would tell us that in passing the baton, you have to be in motion to pass it. You don't stop and pass it. And so perhaps that is a metaphor for those of you who are receiving the baton from those of us who have been running with it. We need to still be in motion with you, just not stop and turn it over. We have heard our sister Huraya raise the question of economics, a very important question. We have heard our sister raise the issue of Black education. I mean, that's of an independent education and the resources that we have accumulated and the thousands of students who are thirsty for knowledge. We've heard about, and I would conclude on this, Brother Bob Brown, as well as Brother Deidre brought to us this issue of different currents in Pan-Africanism. And the question then before us is, which decision will we make? Will it be the more progressive, radical transformation, self-determined, independent, sovereign approaches, plural, to Pan-Africanism, or will it be within the context of the legacy of slavery, colonialism, neo-colonialism, and the dominant world capitalist system, where we see people like Colonel Austin, Vice President Harris, whom we may like because they're Black people, we may be proud because they have achieved. And I would say, finally, I think we need to question, they are their own masters. They are not alienated Black people from some essentialized notion of who Africans are or what Pan-Africanism is. We have to recognize that we can be as evil as the most evilest, as great as the greatest, and greater than the greatest have ever been, because the cradle of civilization comes from Africa. We are the ones who brought enlightenment to the world. And in that context, I again want to thank Sister Higginbotham and the other sisters who have organized this forum, and go back to recognizing Queen Mother Moore and Sister Dara Abu Bakari, who also had to democratize the vantage points about the most progressive and radical dimensions of Pan-Africanism by saying to we Black men, y'all ain't the only ones who got thoughts. And remembering what Mary McLeod Bethune, who said that the Negro community's quality is best judged by the contribution of its womanhood. Thank you.
Great ending notes. And Damani, your last words.
Yes, I would like to conclude by addressing the question that Sister Claudette asked before. What is an African? And of course, you know, it's subject to a lot of different viewpoints, perspectives, and ideologies. But I would simply say that an African is someone who is descended from people from Africa. It may sound simplistic, but I think it's the simplest way to go. Now, you know, there are some people who won't be comfortable with that. I recall the documentary done by Ali Mazwiri on Africa, where he interviewed these two brothers in East Africa who were indistinguishable from, appearance of any other Kenyans that you might see on the street. And these two brothers swore they were Persians. And when I was growing up, people claimed to be Japtalian. And I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, but the point is, whatever our subjective viewpoints are, and no matter how spotted up our family is, as Malcolm said, if you're descendant from people from Africa, you can claim to be an African. Now, maybe you don't want to be. Maybe you want to be, something else. Well, go and be happy. That's what I say. I'm not trying to claim you. But if you've got African ancestry and you want to be an African, then be African. And don't try to be a carbon copy of somebody else.
Hear ye.
Thank you, Damani.
We have these people who are, I call them ABV. They want to be anything but Black. And I'm with you, Damani. There's the door. We don't need you. There's plenty of us. We're good. So on that note, there are still a few hands up, and we honestly could go on and on, but out of respect for our guests, who I'm so happy they gave up their time, we're going to conclude our discussion for today, but make it very clear that this is a continuing conversation and that we will have it on another day. So if you're on this call and you feel that you have another perspective that you want to share around Pan Africanism or the unity, because you notice I always sign off, I say that in the spirit of unity and community, I believe that our passcode every week is we are one. I believe that our unity is that we all have African roots. My roots are American, somebody else's roots are Jamaican, somebody else's roots are Haitian, but what brings us together, what unites us, which makes all of us unique and wonderful and brilliant people, is our African roots. Somebody asked in the chats, a young person, what should be her first country to visit in Africa? I've been to 7 countries, and my first country was Egypt. And even though you all see in the news this week where Kevin Hart caught some flack because he dared suggest that the original Egyptians were Black, they were. And our ancestors left us plenty of information to prove it, from the hieroglyphics in the catacombs to the wigs that they raided in the tombs, which I can tell you, it blew my mind, because any hairstyle that we've ever worn, ladies, it was there, from afros to dreadlocks to cornrows. All of it was in wigs. So people can try and rewrite history all they want. They can try and stop us from telling our history. But I say travel. Dean Keene left us. I don't know. I think it was Dean Keene who was giving us pointers on things that we can do. Get out to different restaurants and make a point of not only eating there and trying the different foods, but talking to the people at the restaurant, be it Jamaican, African, whatever the case, and Black American, y'all. We got a rich history too that we also must celebrate. If you know of events that are happening, tell it. Let us know what's happening. Show up. Support those things. And I forget, Damani gave a few other examples, but we just have to be intentional. That was the other thing, be intentional about knowing our global history. And when we travel abroad and we see young Africans in Confederate flags or with sagging pants or whatever, can we please just let them know that's not who we are. That's not who we are. TV is powerful. I had that experience when I was in Gambia. If I didn't know that I was in Gambia, I would have thought that I was on a beach in the United States. That's just how powerful is the influence of what they see on TV. And I say to my young people who are on this call that we do have a responsibility to show up in a way that can be, that we can be proud of. So on that note, I'm going to thank both of my guests and all of you. Everybody on this call was my guest. And you all know how we conclude. Those of you who don't know how we conclude, you'll find out right now. So if everybody can unmute for a moment I just want to say thank you again for another wonderful Sunday. And as we know, when Black people gather,
Amazing
things happen.
Yes.
Things happen.
and this has been another amazing Sunday. And I just thank you all for coming. And I'm going to hang around for a minute, but we're going to stop recording. Thank you, Damani and Ife. I know you're somewhere there in the background. And thank you, James Early. And we look to have you join us again. Thank you.
Forward ever, backward never. Thank you.
That's right. Forward ever, backward never. Africa must unite.
Yes.
All right. All right. Take care.
Thank you. And make sure you come back next week, everybody, for the discussion that we're going to have on reparations, which will be led by Linda McDonald Carter and Barbara Ransom, who are on this call. And I was going to call them out to give us some more information, but we're getting late. So just know that that will be our call next week. Thank you so much.
Can you put that in the chat?
I certainly will. I put it there once, but I'll put it there again. I sure will. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Helen. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Great conversation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
Thanks,
as
everyone.
always.
Thank you.
And James, thank you, brother.
Listen,
Great
thank
job,
you,
man.
brother. I'm going to try to see you in Panama as soon as I can.
All right, that sounds great.
We all coming to Panama. What you talking about?
Yeah, you know what? So we should do let's plan a gathering in Panama.
Hey,
See?
hey.
Hi, Damani, this is Cynthia. You know the migration is to Panama. I know people are actually getting their residency. You know, we missed the boat. When were we there for that conference with you?
Yeah, yeah.
2006.
Yeah.
Can you believe it's that
2006.
long
You
ago?
should have done a thing.
2006.
You tried to get us. You tried to get us to see it.
Tried to tell
He's
y'all.
trying to sell his house now so he can go back and buy his house.
Yes. Well, I know he's trying to sell it, but but there are people who are coming. I know people who are migrating that way.
Yes, a lot of
it's-
migration happening.
There's so
Yeah.
many
Early.
Black folks coming to Panama. It's not even funny.
I
y'all.
know that's where the
Yeah,
migration
that's
is
right.
now.
That's right.
Panama is the Ghana of South America.
That's right.
Central America.
Central America.
Central America.
Damani,
Yes.
you and Ife did that conference. That's when NC and I came.
That's what
Yes.
he said in
Have you
2006.
thought about doing it again?
No, we have not.
That sounds
Well, it
definitive.
Damani,
So you're waiting for a new
we
generation to do it.
We can
right?
help. We can help. Okay.
No, y'all can do it.
Hey, I heard that.
He is passing
It
the
will come.
baton. The baton has been passed.
Well, to pass it, remember, somebody's got to be moving.
Hey,
That's right.
Exactly. But it was such a great conference. It really was.
It really was.
Really
So,
worked
so
hard.
since we're talking about it, let me just share that my wife Ife is the one who put this conference on.
Yeah.
She had a committee. It was very great, and it was based on the themes that she explored in her book called "Cancer of the Spirit" that she published in 2003.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just an amazing conference. We had 80 people that came from the U.S.
really was.
25 folks from Panama, all but 2 or 3 of them Black folks.
Mhm.
And it was absolutely amazing. And we had like
It was
14 or
amazing.
16 presenters, and it was off the chain.
Yes,
It was. It really was.
was.
You know, and
Helen, I'm gone.
and we were
okay,
hoping.
and I'm going to stop recording. We never stopped recording because I wanted to
Sorry
capture.
to interrupt, Damani. I'll be in touch. Helen, let's talk
Okay,
soon.
brother.
Absolutely.
All right, man. Take care, man. Thank you, man.
Okay. All right.
Lonnie, take care. Thank you for